I'd like to call the meeting to order. It's 8:01. Morning, everybody. The last day of September 2021. Joel, will you read the board secretary statement? Joel.
Yes, hold on just 1 second because now mine has disappeared. One of those fun days. Here we go. Good morning, board, staff, and members of the public. After my statement, the chairman will open this meeting and explain the rules for this electronic meeting. Please keep your microphone on mute when you are not speaking. The technical support team may proactively mute participants if the microphone is picking up background noise. Board members should check to make sure the microphone is not muted before speaking. You may text me at 540-336-3948 at any time during the meeting if you need technical support, and an IT tech will call your cell phone to assist. I now turn the meeting over to Committee Chairman Allen.
Thank you, Jewel. In accordance with the governor's state of emergency declaration, executive orders regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors continuing ordinance and General Assembly 2020 budget amendments 28 and 137, Loudoun Water will meet today in an electronic meeting. In compliance with these special procedures, only action items necessary to continue operations of Loudoun Water and the discharge of its lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities will be discussed during today's meeting. Reports and other meeting information are available on board docs. Public notice and meeting access information was provided on the Loudoun Water website. A recording of the meeting will be available at the link loudounwater.org, virtual meetings-recordings. Board members wishing to speak are reminded to press unmute and identify themselves by name so that staff can accurately capture comments. All items will be recommended to the October 14th, 2020 board meeting. The board secretary will now take a roll call attendance of the committee members.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Mr. Byers? Mr. Byers has sent a message saying he would not be available today. Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Here.
I'd also like to acknowledge that Mr. Koblis and Mr. Sultan are on the call, as well as Dave Hyder and Jonathan Rock. Thank you.
And I'm here as well. Okay, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll make a motion. We approve the agenda.
So moved. I'll second.
Got him. Ready for the vote?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Byers, absent. Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, action items. We have one on the agenda today. Is the approval of a resolution of intent to revise user rates, reclaim water rates, availability charges, and other fees and charges by Mr. Carnes. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. As you mentioned, we're here today to seek a resolution of intent to revise some user rates, reclaimed water rates, availability charges, as well as connection, inspection, plan review, record drawing, and CCTV fees. As you'll see, we are proposing inflationary increases across the board for all of the aforementioned rates, charges, and fees. There's a lot there. This was definitely a team effort. We had a large group of folks throughout the organization who provided data and insight into what they do to make sure that we captured all the costs that are needed for this cost of service study. And if you approve, there'll be even more folks who contribute towards the communication plan and getting all of this set up in the system and ready to go for January 1st. As noted in an email that you received from Carla earlier this week, our plan is to come back to you at some point next year with a little more info about availability charges. So we'll keep you posted on how we progress with that. But for today, we contracted with Stantec Consulting, who we've worked with in the past to conduct cost of service studies. And so joining us today from Stantec is Dave Hyder. He will be conducting this workshop and presentation. And so if you have any questions along the way, please just jump in and ask, and Dave or myself or someone else will help answer. And so with that, I will turn things over to Dave.
All right. Well, good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Just making sure I have control here real quick. Looks like I do. Perfect. Well, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. And as Brian mentioned, please let me know if you have any questions as we go through. We want this to be interactive in nature, so please, please do stop me. In terms of what we're going to discuss today is really all the topics that were covered during the rate study. So we'll talk about the user rates, the reclaimed water rates, the availability charge analysis that's been completed, the other fees and charges, which are really the developer fees, and then we'll talk about the schedule for implementation. So I want to start off with user rates and provide a little bit of background just in terms of how you currently structure your rates. So you really have two classes of customers that have slightly different rate structures. Residential rates are essentially incorporate a fixed charge for water. So that charge is charged regardless of water use on a quarterly basis, and it's the same for all your residential customers. And then for metered water use, you have a three-tiered inclining block rate structure is what it's typically called. So the more water you use, the more expensive it becomes as you fall into each of the tiers. So tier 1 is 0 to 25, tier 2 is 25,000 to 50, and then over 50,000. So that's the water rate structure for residential customers. The sewer is a little bit simpler. It is again incorporates a fixed charge that's charged on a quarterly basis, regardless of water use. And then you just have a uniform sewer rate. So all metered water is charged the same rate, but it is capped based upon your winter water consumption plus 3,000 gallons. So if somebody's using water outside the home, they're essentially not paying sewer charges for that for residential customers. And then commercial is very similar. You have a quarterly fixed charge as well, but that is based on meter size and it's scaled based on meter size. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And then for usage, you have two-tiered rate structure. So the first tier is based upon the reserved capacity, so the amount of capacity that a customer purchased with their availability charge. And then all usage above that is charged at a higher rate for water. And then on sewer, you also have a quarterly fixed charge based on meter size, and then all metered water is charged at a uniform rate. So there is no cap on the sewer side. So when we look at the rate structure, there's a thought and design behind it in terms of the water rate structure. And some of those components that we check when we're looking at the rates and doing the analysis is first off, to the fixed charges, they should generate about 25 to 30% of the revenues of the system. And what we're going to be talking about today, they do generate 30% of the revenues over the next 3 years. The residential tier 1 and 2 plus commercial tier 1 is really intended to cover the basic cost of operating the system. So the operating maintenance of the system plus debt service is supposed to be funded from those revenues. And then when you get into the higher tiers, so tier 3 for residential, tier 2 for commercial, is folks are using really more than they purchased. So it's really rented capacity is one way to look at it. And that's intended to fund the replacement reserve contribution because essentially they're using more capacity than they purchased. Therefore, it's accelerating the replacement needs of the water and sewer system assets. Okay, so what we're looking at today and what we're proposing is, as Brian alluded to, inflationary increases in the water and sewer rates. So proposing a 3-year rate plan, which would incorporate 3% increases in the water rates for 22, 23, 24, and then 3% on the sewer rates. And you can see that would equate to about, in the first year, $6.60 for your typical residential customer who uses about 21,000 gallons a quarter. And then in the next year, it would be $6.67 and then $7.12. And I do see a hand raised, so I'm going to take a pause.
Mr. Kobliss?
Yes, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Why is there a,
Oops.
yeah, that one. Why is this separation of that tier 3 and commercial tier 2 pay for these 3 extras? I mean, isn't it, I don't see why it's these items are paid by these 2 things when why isn't everything paid by 1, 2, 3, 1, 2?
So everybody pays as you go through the tiers. I guess one way to look at it is as you go through the tiers, you're paying, you're contributing to operations and maintenance and debt. So if I go into tier 3, and hopefully I'm understanding this correctly, if I go into tier 3, I've already paid in tier 1 and tier 2. So I've already paid for the O&M and debt service on the system.
No, I understand that. I'm just
Okay.
wondering why there's a separation.
I think that the reason that you would want to separate is that when you pay an availability charge per connection, you're buying so much capacity in the system. And what we're saying is when you get to those other tiers, you're using someone else's capacity. And so
got it. Okay, I got it. I got it now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I see another hand.
Yeah, morning. You could, I know you went over this, but if you could just in dollars, tell us what the fixed quarterly charge is. I guess that's you pay that regardless. And then the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, it's what would that approximate? How does that break down, in other words?
Yep. Those are on the next slides.
Sorry.
If that works. So yeah, we'll get there in next 2 slides. I did want to just mention a couple other things. Just in terms of, we'll talk today a lot about inflationary increases, and this is what we anticipated in the 2018 study. We thought that you'd need probably 3% increases, and so things have played out consistent with that. And we do think going forward, even though we're just talking about a 3-year plan today, you're probably going to continue to need to do inflationary increases in the future. And so now I'm going to get to the fixed charges. So a lot going on the slide, and take a few minutes here because it is a little bit of a change. And I want to make sure we're clear on what we're proposing here. So as I mentioned, all residential customers, and these are just the water fixed charges, pay the same fixed charge. So we see here on the first line, the current quarterly fixed charge for water is $36.74. And what's being proposed is a 3% increase each subsequent year going forward. As I also mentioned, your fixed charges for commercial scale based on meter size. So as you can see here, as you get to a bigger meter, the fixed charges get larger. But during our analysis, what we often look at is the ratios in terms of how are those fixed charges scaled. So if we look at the ratio between a 5/8 and a 3/4, the current scaling is 1.41. In terms of the 3/4 is that much more expensive in terms of a fixed charge. And so what we're proposing is to align the fixed charges in 2022 with an updated scaling factors, which would be consistent with your availability charges, which scale at these ratios. And these ratios are also consistent with industry standard in terms of the capacity of a meter. And so essentially what you're doing here is you're aligning the fixed charges with the capacity associated with that meter. You will note though, as you get to the larger meters, they would see a larger increase than 3% because we are aligning them with the appropriate scaling. In subsequent years, once we get to that appropriate scaling, we would be doing just that 3% increase in 23 and 24. So on the sewer side, again, proposing the exact same thing. The current fixed charge for residential customers is $36.71, then a 3% increase each subsequent year. The scaling is, again, not necessarily consistent with the availability charges. And so we would propose in 2022 to address that scaling and then have the 3% going forward.
Dave, I'm not sure, and Mr. Kelly can correct me. I think my understanding of Mr. Kelly's question was of our total revenues that we collect, if we're collecting that 30 to 35% from basic charges, do we have a breakdown of where the rest of it is coming from? Is that what you were asking, Sean? Like how much we get from each tier?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that question. Thanks. I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, I guess the way I interpreted this is I got a 5/8 inch meter and I pay a fixed charge or $36.71. Does that get me up to 25,000 gallons of water?
No.
And then, no?
Yeah, no, there's no usage associated with the fixed charges. So you're going to pay that whether you use any water or not. There's no,
Right.
yeah.
But I'm looking at the tiers, and when do I start paying a tier? How does that tier
Right.
scale work, I guess?
Right. So the first tier was really implemented, and I don't want to speak for Dave, but was really implemented for those that try to conserve water, use less water. So it is more of a, I don't like to call it a conservation tier, but it's for those who use less water. Tier 2 gets you to that amount of capacity that you've purchased in the system, which is about 50,000 gallons.
Okay.
So what we're saying is through an availability charge, you purchased, or someone, the developer, has purchased 50,000 gallons of water for a quarter in the system. Once you use more than that, as I mentioned to Mr. Kobelis, you're kind of borrowing from someone else. We don't make any, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, we don't expect to cover regular O&M with any residential tier 3 because our goal is that people stick to what they purchase, ultimately. But if we do collect in that tier 3, that would be part of our repair and replacement funding. Does that make sense, Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Does that
Thanks.
answer your question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.
Mr. Campbell has a question.
Thank you. Take my hand in there. So my question was, what's the fixed charge scaling. So this proposed scaling is a pretty radical departure for the larger meter sizes from what we've been doing. And we just heard the rationale for doing that. What was our previous rationale? How did we get to these previous figures?
Well, I think they've been in place for quite a while. I think it goes back to like 2009 original rate study. And I think what's happened is just over time, as you've increased the rates going forward, I think there was some rationale at one point in terms of, and I don't know that you ever intended it be to 1307, for example. I think that they, just got out of alignment to some degree.
Yeah, I think part of that is, when we would say that we're going to do a 3 or 3.5% increase across the board, we just did that, right? We did it across the board for all of these meter sizes, and it just didn't equate over time, and we got off on those demand ratios. And so what we're trying to do now is when we have an availability charge that we need to assess for an 1.5 inch meter, it's 6.5 times what a 5/8 inch would pay. Well, it would make sense then that going forward, the user of that would also pay 6.5 times more on a basic charge, and they just got off over time.
Okay. And so back in 2009, were the original ratios that we used basically consistent with what we're updating it, or did we use a different criteria in 2009?
Yeah, I believe they were based on the capacities of the meters. There was rationale.
And that's what we're doing here. These ratios are based on the capacity of the meter sizes.
Correct. Yep.
I'm just trying to anticipate if we get a question from a large user and they're going, you just doubled my my fixed charge, why? These are tough times or what have you, and I'm going, I don't know. I'm kind of those were the right ratios to use. I don't know.
Right. I mean, I guess we're kind of correcting a wrong from over the years, and so that while that's not going to sit well for some, the reality is that the updated ones are more they're aligned with the availability charge and what they should be. So, Mr. Kobelis?
Yes, real quick, I just want to make sure I've got this. This is the fixed charge. Let's just talk about a 6-inch meter. So I have a 6-inch meter, and every quarter I pay $1,587 as my fixed charge, and now it's going to go up to $2,500. And
Right.
then on top of that, my usage charge is just going to go up 3%. So the only thing that we're seeing here is the fixed charge monthly going up,
That's
right?
That's correct. This slide reflects
Okay.
the fixed charge only.
So everybody with a 6-inch meter is going to go up $1,000 a quarter.
Yes.
Okay.
And generally, customers with meters that large do use a lot of water, so the percentage of their bill that's related to the fixed charge is often smaller. So, but you're correct. These are just the fixed charges per quarter.
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
No, I think that's Mr. Allen, Jewel.
All right, so I'm still a little bit confused, so I'm getting closer. So when we look at the meter size, what I'm confused about is, shouldn't the charge on the meter already reflect that the meter's larger size, therefore it would use more water? So what we're saying is it doesn't really, like before we were charging, 43.24 for a 6-inch meter. Now we're going to 68 with the scaling. It was just antiquated. Our original way of determining a fixed charge for a meter size wasn't really accurate, and this just brings it up to accuracy. Is that correct?
Well, I think what I would say is back in 2009, or whenever that rate study was, that the demand, we typically call these demand ratios, right? The demand ratios that we had in place when you compare these larger meters to a 5/8 inch were accurate at that time. And since then, we've just been kind of doing these rate increases across the board kind of thing, right? And they're not keeping up with the demand ratio calculation. What we probably should have been doing was holding those demand ratios steady, as they would have been, right? 3%, I mean, the 3 times the 6.5, hold those steady. And then apply 3% to that. I know that's a little confusing, but the updated scaling reflects today's demand ratio for those meters. I'd have to defer to Dave. I didn't look at the 2009. There may have been some changes from that.
So in 2009, was somebody who's using a 6-inch meter using X amount of water, and now in 2021, that same person with a 6-inch meter is using more than they were in 2009?
No, they're not. It is just it's a true up essentially of the ratios, and the demand associated with the 6-inch meter hasn't changed. It's just that the ratios got out of alignment. And I think one way to think of it is,
so in the ratio, what's the numerator and what's the denominator? Maybe that'll help me understand.
I think the I'm getting confused with numerator and denominator. So, but I think the way to look at it is a 5/8 inch meter has the capacity to have X amount of water go through it. A 6-inch meter has 68 times that capacity. Would you agree with that, Dave? Exactly. And that's how we were supposed to be, or have been. That's our rationale for these demand ratios, is that meter has the ability to pass through it 68 times more water than a residential customer. Therefore, your basic charge and your availability charge 68 times more.
And taking that one, that's correct. And taking it one step further, if you just think of an analogy of, a 5/8 residential home can pull so much water, and therefore you have to be ready to serve that amount of water, and therefore you're incurring fixed costs associated with that. And so that goes back to the trying to get 30% of your revenues from the fixed charge. The 6-inch meter is equivalent to 68 homes sitting out there, and so you need to be ready to be able to serve that much more water, and you're incurring those costs in having that capacity ready to serve. And so this is essentially just truing up those ratios to make sure that folks are paying in the fixed charge the appropriate costs associated with being ready to serve them from that perspective.
Okay, so if someone asked me that question, the appropriate answer would be for the 6-inch meter size that we haven't really been charging you the appropriate ratio in the past, given the analogy that you just made, Dave. So,
yep.
Okay, all right. I think I'm better on it. Thanks.
Mr. Kobelis.
Yeah, I just, I mean, isn't the next step then we go in front of the public and present these rates, and don't we have some kind of public meeting for this or do we're just going to kind of say, okay, here it is now, guys?
Oh, no, there's a whole communication plan that we would implement. So we would have, first the board would approve this resolution of intent.
I got it. I just want to make sure that's what we're doing. And I would just suggest that we don't talk about that we screwed up before, that that we were making a mistake and we didn't have the right rates. I would just concentrate on what the costs actually are, and that's why these rates are there. And it's just a suggestion that I would do. I wouldn't talk about that we didn't do it right before and now we're trying to play catch up. I think it's more the fact that these are the costs and this is what it costs us and this is why the charge is going to be there. I don't know.
Right. And I I don't want to sound offensive. I'm not sure it's completely that we were wrong before, because we wanted that 3% increase across the board. So that part was correct. But we also have specific meetings with the industry representatives, which would be NAOP and MBBIA. We have meetings with them. And so Hui Tran and Robin Bailey, they will be in front of them explaining all of this, talking to them about it. And then, of course, they have the public hearing as an opportunity to come forward as well. But our hope is that we can answer their questions at those individual meetings. And it's typically what happens. So whole communication plan that we'll implement once we get the resolution of intent. Mr. Allen?
Just a quick question. How many customers do we have with six-inch meters? Just for, I'm wondering how pervasive it is. Is it a couple dozen or is it hundreds, or do we have any idea?
I can tell Dave's looking that up right now. There's not a lot, no.
I think you have 2. I think there's only two accounts that have 6-inch meters.
Okay. All right. So it's not a really large group of people.
No.
No, and yeah, like I said, I think if $1,000 on I don't know what their bills are, but they're pretty significant if you have a meter that size.
But we wanted to be transparent with this too. We didn't want to say to you that we're doing a 3% across the board, when the reality is, when you dig deeper into these meter sizes, it's not a clear 3%. And so, we'll have those communications with them as well. And if we're talking about 2 accounts, it's something that we can handle with them also individually. Mr. Kelly?
Thanks, Carl. I think Mark makes a really good point. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm having some connection problems.
Yes.
Sound like you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Because I don't. I want to. We want to avoid. It's all about the messaging. We want to avoid what has happened back probably 6 years ago or so, or we had a true up because there was overusage. I'm thinking the veterinary clinic case and so forth, some of our commercial customers, where we had to go back and kind of true up because they were overusing what their meter was intended for, if I recall the issue. So I think, we've got to be careful we don't go down that road that, as Mark said, just avoid talking about the past, and we're just kind of, this is our cost and this is the way it's going to be.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Dave before we move on? Okay, Dave?
All right, hearing none. That was certainly the most involved and complicated topic that we have in terms of the discussion today. So I think the rest of it should be a little bit more straightforward. But this is the other component of the charges. So these are the actual rates. So as I mentioned before, you have residential 3-tier. These are the volumes. So once you start using water, you pay $2.69 per 1,000 gallons in tier 1. Then once you go into tier 2, you pay $7.47, and then once you're in tier 3, you're paying $10. And so these are all just 3% increases, as I mentioned earlier. So these would be the unit rates for residential and commercial customers with that 3% increase. Commercial has $3.53 as their tier 1, and then tier 2 is $6.07. And then all usage on the sewer side is currently $5.27. And with the 3% increase, you can see what the unit rates would be, going up to $5.76 by the end of the rate period. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about kind of why we're talking inflationary and some of the drivers behind why rate increases are necessary. So some of the reasons why we're talking inflationary increases is in our last study, we had to forecast the Trap Rock water treatment plant cost, and those have come in consistent with those forecasts. And so that's why the 3% is holding true. However, you do have a significant capital improvement program, still have tremendous investments that are required for expansion of the system as well as system replacements. So that funding needs to be there. When we look outside of Trap Rock, the other actual costs have been consistent with prior forecasting. And so that's, again, one of the reasons we can do inflationary. And then we're also funding the repair and replacement reserve. So all of those items are driving the need for additional funding within the system. Then going a little bit further, we do have a 10-year forecasting model that we use to look at the rates. And what we term the revenue requirements is essentially the total cost of operating the system, the water and sewer systems. And we make assumptions within the model. And so we take the budget and then forecast at a line item by line item basis. And some of the cost escalation factors that we're using are shown here. So employee salaries, benefits are forecasted to go up at 5% per year, electricity at 7%, and then general operating are generally within line with inflation at 3% per year. Also consistent in the models, we want to look at what do we anticipate in terms of growth. And so we have those forecasts are consistent with the county's projections for equivalent residential connections. About 40% of your capital improvement plan is scheduled to be funded with user rates. And given the cash reserves, the availability fee funding, and the forecast, we're forecasting that you're not going to need to borrow much in the future. We're estimating maybe $20 million in 2024 at this point. So minimal borrowing is included in the forecast. So another key component I mentioned earlier is just funding of repair and replacement. So you do have robust funding of repair and replacement, both in funding of repair and replacement projects in the CIP. So cash funding of repair and replacement plus contributions to reserves ultimately gets you to funding between 37 million to 44 million over that projection period. And one of the targets that we've historically looked at is to fund at least 50% of depreciation on an annual basis. And so you can see that with this forecast, you're above that, which is a good thing. You're addressing the repair and replacement needs. And I'm going to pause for a question.
Yeah, thank you. Does this fit with sort of the gut check that we were working on with the 100-year sort of view? I'm assuming you've seen that, but obviously it's so far out that it's really difficult to have concrete information. A 10-year view is a lot better data, but does it still jive with sort of a really long-term view that we go, yeah, our rates, our fees are all kind of matching up to make sure we're not running out of money and having to do some big cost increase 40 years from now or something?
Yeah, I can start the discussion on that. It definitely does. So we do look at over a 10-year period, and you are able to, consistent with this funding of depreciation, when we're above 50%, we're definitely addressing that, and it's going to continue to scale up. I believe in the forecast we're looking you're in the 70s in the second 10-year window. So from my perspective, we're definitely not selling the utility short in terms of transitioning to making sure that rates are funding the repair and replacement of the system. So, but Carl, I don't know if you want to chime in terms of the longer view outside of that 10 years.
Right. I mean, really from a rate and financial planning perspective, or plan of finance perspective, even 10 years, gets a little gray. But what I can say is that the rate model, the asset management program, and the capital improvement program are all intertwined. So they kind of feed off of each other. So I think the answer to your question is yes. This is setting us up very well to continue that trend of funding repair and replacement, and then being prepared when those assets are ready to be replaced.
Great, those are great answers, and thank you. And the reason I bring them up periodically in these things is we just have so many examples across the country of utilities that thought they were setting aside enough money and didn't, and it seems like that's the norm. And I mean, you guys would know better than I, but whether there's an older utility that actually got this right. And when I've asked that question in the past, people struggle to come up with even a single example of, hey, over here in Ohio, they did a great job and they didn't run out of money. It seems like everybody runs out of money. So I'll keep bringing it up periodically, but you all are doing a great job, and those are great answers.
Yeah. Mr. Allen?
Thank you. Yeah, Brett, you probably don't hear about those utilities because you only hear bad news. You don't really hear good news. So, but how come we're not putting anything in reserves in 2022 and 2023?
Yeah, it's really the function of the model. So we're looking at balancing between funding of cash funded repair and replacement versus contributions to reserves. And so ultimately, we're addressing those needs in those particular years. And given the fact that you're spending that much from cash, essentially we're not contributing in those years, if that makes sense. It's really a balance between the two. Ultimately, we want to have a total that makes sure we're funding depreciation. So whether you're contributing to it or you're making those investments is the key
I think it's also a reflection of, again, that your 3 to 5 year plan is much clearer
Right.
than your 5 to 10 year plan, and so we know based on our cash balance and our cash policies that we are able to cash fund those repair and replacement projects over the next 2 years. And there's assumptions in there that we actually get to all those projects and we actually get them done. And so, it's kind of a moving target, but I think it's a good indication that we do have the cash that we need in the immediate future to fund those repair and replacement projects.
No, and I see by the totals, if you add the two up, they're very similar over the next 5 years. So that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And if in 2024 we have more R&R projects, then would we adjust our contributions to the reserve, try to keep those numbers equal?
We
Yes.
would, right, Dave? Yes.
All right, thanks.
Sure. Mr. Kelly.
Thanks, Carla. Are we playing a little bit of catch up in 2022 with depreciation? It kind of flattens out after that to around 60%.
I'll have to defer to you, Dave.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really catch up. It's just very concrete projects because it's in that fiscal year 22. We have, we have a detailed CIP, but I think it's more reflective of the needs of the system versus an intentional catch up or anything like that. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
And I can speak to, there is one utility that we work with in Ohio. Cleveland Water actually has done a very, very good job of not facing the looming infrastructure issues. So it's funny you mention Ohio because that's the one that comes to mind. So
thank you, and to that, thank you for saying that. And so in that example, presumably that utility is no longer having the kind of robust growth that has driven our system for years, and yet they've been able to transition away from being funded by availability fees, and they've done so in a responsible way, so that it's all working. Is that what you're saying?
it is. It's even worse because they've faced tremendous declines in use, and so they've done what they've needed to do to invest in the system. They've raised rates, and they have gotten criticized for it. They haven't. We've also seen what like Baltimore and other cities that haven't gotten it right have had to face, with huge increases. So, but I, from my perspective, what Loudon Water is doing is fantastic in terms of blending. You're not living off of availability charges now and setting yourself up for this astronomical need in the future, which would be, an easy thing to do because I've seen utilities that do that. So you're proactively addressing the needs and making sure that shift and setting yourself up for success in the future.
And Cleveland hasn't had to do like a major rate increase along the way. They've been able to just keep it something in tune with inflation, something relatively reasonable.
They've been above inflation, but they haven't done the astronomical, 10% for 10 years or something like that, like we're seeing in Baltimore.
Okay, that's great. Well, and if there, and Carla, to the extent there's any lessons we can learn from Cleveland or points, I'm sure you guys have already incorporated that, but it's always interesting to see what other folks are doing and what's working and what's not. So thanks, Dave.
Absolutely. Mr. Kelly?
Thanks, Carla. Just a question for you, Carla, or Brian, and just to Brent's point, I pick up on that. As I recall, 2, 3, 4 years ago, whatever, when Moody's finally gave us a AAA rating, one of their justifications was that our move away from reliance on availability charges and ongoing operating revenues now supporting, the expenses of Loudon Water. Is that true?
That's true. That was a statement that they made. It always frustrated us though, because we weren't using availability charges for O&M, but our philosophy is, with our availability charges, that growth will pay for growth. And the goal is at the end of the day, when the system is built out, all of the capital infrastructure has been paid for through those capital charges. And then, the users are then responsible. And we continue to transition towards that, even with debt issuance, right? Now our customers pay 100% of the interest, and we're transitioning more of the principal to them as well. So, through Dave's help and through this robust model that we have, we're able to move to that point. But yes, they did make that comment, and I think after meeting with them a couple times since, they understand that we are not reliant on availability charges for operations and maintenance.
Do the rating agencies take that into account when they give us a rating, our replacement on our reserves?
They do, and they also, while it's not in our master indenture, we also do a calculation of what our coverage is without availability charges, and so they're very happy with that as well. Brian, did you have anything to add? I know you're intimately involved with the review this year by Moody's.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Mr. Kelly, that the board did adopt a policy several years ago in response to that, where it used to be the net revenue, or we had to maintain 1.5 coverage of net revenues, with availability charges, and then you added a new policy where it's 1.0 without availability charges. So that the rating agencies like that as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we'll keep moving. Next slide just shows a comparison. So this is where the kind of rubber meets the road in terms of what a customer pays. So a typical residential customer, their bill at 21,000 gallons usage, their quarterly bill is currently about a little over $219 per quarter. With the 3% increase, that would go up to $226 in 2022. And then you can see just some surrounding comparable jurisdictions, what their current charges are for the same quantities of water. And for those that we know, like Fairfax County, we know that they're increasing their sewer rates. I don't know that the Water Authority is increasing their water rates, but their rates are anticipated to go up. I'm not sure about Prince William County or the town of Leesburg, but so this is somewhat of a current rates and then your future rates. And then we don't know, potentially some of the other jurisdictions may be raising rates too.
Mr. Kovlis has a question.
Yeah, real quick, we see this slide, I don't know, 2-3 times a year, it seems. But I'm sure that Fairfax County and Prince William County and Loudoun, the costs or their charges are exclusively for water and sewer. Is the town of Leesburg exclusively for water and sewer, those charges, or are they putting other things into that charge that's outside water and sewer?
From my perspective, it should be just water and sewer. I mean, I worked for them maybe 15 years ago, and at the time, there are support services that the town provides to the enterprise fund, but I believe they set it up as an enterprise fund, so it should be. But I don't know if Carla has any more intimate knowledge of the town of Leesburg.
I don't know exactly how they do their modeling, but as Dave said, I mean, they have a water and sewer fund, and I'm assuming that their rates are based solely on those expenses.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, I've got some personal experience with town of Leesburg outside rates. Yeah, it's just water and sewer, and I got 6 kids too. So when you do those tiered rate structures, you start paying a lot of money every month for water and sewer. So it's just water and sewer. Unfortunately, I should at least get a Christmas card, cookie, something from all that. That's it.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to transition to the reclaim water rates, and a little bit simpler here. What really drives reclaimed water rates and the cost as well as the revenues is the demands. And so we work with staff and looking at some other studies that have been completed for Loudoun Water to come up with a demand forecast. So this forecast shows the current average day demands. These do fluctuate significantly depending upon max day and things of that sort. But this is the average day demand, and this is the forecast going forward. So the demand forecast really is just the addition of new customers joining the reclaimed water system. And so you can see by 2026, looking at about 2.25 million gallons per day in this forecast. So what we're recommending is that you also increase the reclaimed water rates at the consistent 3% over the next 3 years. The reclaimed water rates are closely tied with the cost of providing reclaimed water at the Broad Run water reclamation facility. And so these would also be consistent, obviously, with what we've proposed for the water and sewer rates. And then we do anticipate in future years, you'll probably need to continue to do inflationary increases. And the cost of reclaimed water have been consistent with what we looked back in 2018. So what's incorporated in the reclaimed water rates? First, here's the rates. Current rate is $1.65 per 1,000 gallons for reclaimed water. So it equates to a 5% increase each of the next 3 years with that 3% increase that we've proposed. And then in terms of the revenue requirements and the drivers, it's really inflation. So the rate increases do reflect those inflationary increases. The cost associated with reclaimed water specifically we have 2 full-time employees. And then the other key costs are chemicals and electricity, which are closely obviously tied with the demands on the system. And then we also have it set up to make sure that on an annual basis, there is a contribution of 50% of depreciation for the reclaimed water system assets. So that you're essentially being able to set aside funds that will allow you to replace the reclaim system. So if there's no questions on reclaimed, I'll move on to availability charges. So Carla mentioned the goal with availability charges is for new customers to pay for their fair share of the additional facilities that you have to build in anticipation of them, so needed to serve their demand, with the intention of growth paying for growth. And they do recover the cost to provide additional treatment, the transmission system, distribution, collection facilities, but they're not designed to and not calculated to fully fund the capital improvement program. And so what the availability charges look like today, and then what we're proposing is a 3% increase. So as we talked about earlier, the availability charges scale based upon meter size. So the current water availability charge is $7,180, and then you can see it scales up. And these scaling factors are again consistent with the meter size demands that we talked about earlier. And then going forward, what we're proposing is just those 3% across the board for each of the availability charges by meter size for both water and for sewer. So the sewer availability charge for a 5/8 inch meter is $8,711, and you can see how that would increase going forward. So I'm going to pause for a question.
And just for confirmation, we don't have to rescale these rates. They're good. All we're doing is just the 3% raise.
Correct. These are consistent with those scaling factors we talked about earlier. Yep. Okay. So again, we just do a comparison here. This is for a 5/8 inch meter benchmarking. So while I guess the usage rates are more expensive in Leesburg, to connect is a little bit cheaper. But blue is the water availability charge. Red is the sewer availability charge, and this is again for a 5/8 inch meter. So you can see where you are today, and then where you'd be with that 3% increase. Again, we don't know whether the other jurisdictions will be increasing their availability charges in 22. Okay, so our last section is other fees and charges. And these are really the developer fees, are often termed ancillary fees. So these were evaluated in a lot of detail in 2020. We looked at the structure, how the fees are actually assessed, as well as the level of the fees. And these fees include plan review fees, inspection fees, connection charges, the record drawing fees, and CCTV fees. So again, associated with new development. And they were updated and adopted effective January 1st of 2021. And so as part of the rate study, we didn't look at the structure because the structure had just been evaluated, but we did look at the cost of providing the services associated with these fees. And that's really materials and labor are what go into providing these fees. And we are seeing consistent increases in terms of those costs associated with inflation. So consistent with the message today, we are recommending that you just increase those fees with the structure that was adopted back in January at 3% in 22, and then subsequent 3% increases in 23 and 24. So last slide for me anyways is just the schedule for implementation. So as Carla mentioned, there's a robust communication plan, but to facilitate the adoption of the rates by January 1st of 2022, you need to adopt a resolution of intent in October. And there's a plan for advertising the 21st and the 28th. And then there would be a public hearing where this would be presented to the public in November. And then no later than December, you need to adopt that final resolution to ensure that the rates could be effective January 2022. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carla and be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I think, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we are proposing a November 18th public hearing. Again, Mr. Allen and Mr. Kobelis, you can decide if you would want that to be a virtual public hearing. We typically do the user rate public hearing in the evening so that it's convenient for those that work during the day. So right now the resolution of intent reflects a 6 p.m. Public hearing. And what we would do is leave the public comment period open from the public hearing until you vote in December, so that everyone has an opportunity to weigh in, and we would then share that feedback with you. I just wanted to take a minute to say, we do this every 3 years, have an independent review of our rates, and Brian and his team look at it on an annual basis as well. And Dave has helped us create a very robust, user-friendly model that we can do different scenarios throughout the year. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Dave, Brian, Huitran, the DGMs, they have spent and Dale Hamas, who is also on the line, he's helping us with this as well, have spent a tremendous amount of time on these rates, particularly the availability charges. And as we mentioned, we expect to come back next year with more information about that. But I would be remiss if I didn't, say hats off to them, because this is, while when you get to this point, it looks almost routine, when you come up with just a 3% increase, and, but there's so much that goes on to get to this point. So I just wanted to acknowledge them and open it up to any questions that you might have. Brian, I believe, has a motion slide. Or Michael, could you pull that up? Yeah. And we're happy to answer any questions or address any concerns that you have before you take any action to move this to your October meeting.
I'll go ahead and move that we adopt the attached resolution of intent. And great job, everyone. Thanks for all the hard work on this.
I'll second.
Mr. Chairman, just pointing out that the committee is not actually adopting the resolution of intent, but recommending it for adoption by the board.
Thank you.
Jonathan, do I need to amend my statement there, or are we good?
I think we're good. I interpreted it that way.
Thank you.
Jewel, roll call.
Thank you. Mr. Byers is absent. Mr. Campbell,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
and consent or action, sir.
This is gonna have to be an action item.
Very good. Thank you.
And I want to add, to us, to Dave and to Carla and to Brian too. It's a good job, and I'm glad we didn't have 3.5% increases, which is what we had the previous 3 years. So that was nice to see, and especially given today's inflation environment, which is pretty robust. I mean, we're looking at 5+ CPI, I think, this year. So I think it's reasonable, and I was glad it came in at only 3. So.
Thank you all very much. The rating agencies note every time we're in front of them that this is one of the most important things that you do as a board, and your willingness to implement rate increases and on an annual basis. And so thank you for that.
All right, the next item is an information item. It's the monthly finance summary report. Mr. Carnes.
Thank you. Just wait while the PDF is pulled up here. Okay, so operating revenues through the end of August totaled 72.1 million, which is above the forecast of 69.7. Non-operating revenues totaled 34.3, which was above the year-to-date forecast of 25.4. So as you can see, total revenues are 106.3 versus the year-to-date forecast of 95 million. I did want to point out, Mr. Allen, when we discussed the mid-year review, we were talking about water and wastewater revenue and it looking a little low, based on kind of our demand. And as you can see, it's kind of jumped up through August above our forecast. So I think we're trying to see that summer revenue come in now. Expenses are under forecast. Oh, excuse me, a little too far there. 92.6 versus the 98.2. And ERCs through the end of August, we were at 1,800, which is right in line with our reprojected forecast of 2,766. Through the end of September, we've added another 202 so far, which puts us again pretty much right in line with where we thought we would be based on our mid-year review of connections. Capital spending totaled 89.3 million. Oops, sorry, that was the budget for the year. The revised plan at mid-year was 82.5, and the projected through August is 52.5. Actual was 47.2, so right about 90% of where we thought we were going to be. And then total cash equivalents investments at the end of August was a little under 252 million, and the weighted average yield was 0.67%. And I'm happy to take any other questions that you may have.
I just want to say thanks for breaking out the ERCs into data center. I think periodically you get asked that question over the years. So thanks for doing that.
You are very welcome.
Mr. Koblis?
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate Brian on becoming a DGM. I don't know if we've ever officially done that in a meeting, so I just wanted to congratulate him. Well deserved.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Yes, congratulations. Good point, Mark. All right, that's it. Seeing as there's no other questions, there's nothing else on the agenda, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Ready for the vote?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Byers is absent. Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
And Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Meeting
Thank you,
adjourned at
everybody.
9:05.
Enjoy the day. It's beautiful out there.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.